Thanks so much. It's so great to be here. I really appreciate it. Just first of all, I should tell you I wrote the book on Google Docs. I don't know if that means anything. If that means anything to you, but the idea that I could bring my computer or not bring my computer, and just wherever I was at work or on the road, I could write and pick up where I left off, not have to worry about it saving since it saves automatically. It's a great product, and it really helped me write the book. So I'll just talk a little bit about the book, and then I'll take your questions. I guess when I think of the Hellfire Club, I think of it on three basic levels. One of them is this: I tried to write a thriller, what I thought would be fun. It takes place in 1954. A World War II hero turned academic named Charlie Marder and his wife Margaret, who's a zoologist, moved to Washington, D.C. He gets appointed to a congressional seat. And immediately they become ensnared in a grand conspiracy with secret societies and all sorts of factions competing against each other. One of the things that I thought would be fun, and I hope is fun for readers, is I have actual people from that time, like Joe McCarthy and Roy Cohn and John and Robert Kennedy and Eisenhower and others interacting with my fictitious characters, which I thought would be fun. People ask me all the time why the 1950s, and I think of the 1950s as a time that, on its veneer, especially if you're a white male, it is an idyllic period. In our popular culture, we think of Happy Days or American Graffiti. We think of the 50s as a pleasant time, but actually it was a time of real menace. You had actual communists infiltrating the government. You had McCarthyism and the Red Scare. You had the atomic race. In March 1954, Puerto Rican separatists burst into the Capitol and shoot it up and shoot 5 members of the House. There are the bizarre comic book hearings where the U.S. Senate is blaming juvenile delinquency on comic books. Any of you who collect comic books, and I'm guessing at Google it's probably a few, the little Comic Codes Authority little tag on the front page of the comic books is a remnant of that ridiculous era. So I thought it would be fun. I thought it would be just an exciting time to write about. That's one level I think about the book. Another level I think about the book is Charlie Marder, one of the two main characters, comes to Washington to do good. And one of the first things he tries to do is to stop a company, a rubber and tire company that made bad gas masks during World War II, stop them from getting any federal money. And he finds out that in order to do good, he needs to make compromises. And this is something that I've just noticed in Washington, D.C., having lived there now basically since the end of 1992, which is really good people, Democrats and Republicans and independents, come to town to do good things. They want to do good. And a lot of them get trapped in a cycle of compromise, where they dip one foot into the swamp and another foot into the swamp, and the next thing they know, they're up to their neck in swamp, and they don't know how to get out. So that was another thing I wanted to try to capture in the book, is just the idea of why it happens that so many good people that you believe in, you look up and 10 years later and you're like, whatever happened to her, or whatever happened to him? Like, I used to think that that person was pretty cool, and now they're not. Which is not to say that there aren't still a lot of really good people in Congress. There are. The heroes of the book are politicians, and the villains of the book are politicians. So they're both covered. And then the last thing is, in addition to the swamp, the thing that I think is resonant for a lot of readers is, and this was, when I started writing this book years ago, and if you set a book in 1954, and you're going to have characters interacting with real people from the era, obviously Roy Cohn and Joe McCarthy are going to be obvious people you're going to seize upon. I did not know at the time that, Roy Cohn's protege, Donald Trump, was going to be president of the United States by the time the book came out. But it turns out there is this connective tissue, that Senator McCarthy's protege was Roy Cohn, and Roy Cohn's protege was Donald Trump. That's nothing I invented. It just is a reality. And so diving into the 1950s and reading about the time of McCarthyism, and I don't want to, Donald Trump and Joe McCarthy are not the same person, and Trumpism and McCarthyism are not the same thing. But the occurrence of a major political figure using lying and smearing and indecency as his method of art in his political warfare has happened before. And reading about people and how political figures acted or didn't act at the time was very instructive. So some of the book, not a lot of it, I might have played up a little bit, or I did play up a little bit because of the era that we're in. But the rhyming, they say history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And the rhyming was already there. So there is some of that. I thought I'd read one really quick scene to you. I want to apologize ahead of time, especially to a Boston crowd, because I am going to do Robert Kennedy's voice. And I want you to know that I don't think I do it very well. But I can't not do it. One of the thrills about writing this book was the research. I know I'm in a room full of people who like to do research. And last year, I did an event for the 100th anniversary of the birth of John F. Kennedy. And I met Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, who's Robert Kennedy's oldest child. And I was doing, I was in the thick of research. And actually, I had read in several books that her godfather was Joe McCarthy, because the Kennedys and Joe McCarthy were very close. So I fact-checked it with her, and she said, no, it wasn't true, but they were very close. The families were very close, and I asked her why, because Joe McCarthy was a horrible person. And she said it was very tribal because they were all Irish, and the 40s and the 50s were still a period where the Irish were looked down upon. No matter how much the Kennedys achieved, the Boston Brahmins still looked down their noses at the Kennedys, and so they bonded that way. Then another time I was reading, when I was doing research for the book, I was reading a Ted Sorensen biography of John F. Kennedy, and Sorensen kept referring to Robert Kennedy as Bob Kennedy, which I had never heard before in my life, and I'm something of a student of history. And so I emailed Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, did people call your dad Bob? Because I'm reading this book. And she said, yeah, that's what they called him. So I have a character in the book like correcting somebody. Nobody calls him Bobby. Anybody who knows him calls him Bob. Now, I told this anecdote at a publishing event about a year ago, forgetting that one of Robert Kennedy's other kids was in the audience. He had like 100. This one was Carrie Kennedy Cuomo, I think. And I was doing a presentation for the Hellfire Club. She was doing a presentation for a book that was commemorating the 50th anniversary of her father's assassination. And she, after I told that story about Bob and Robert and Bobby, she went on stage and corrected me. She said it wasn't necessarily true. People called him Bob, some people called him Bobby, some people called him Senator. And I went up to her afterwards and I said, your oldest sister is the one who told me the Bob thing, and I'm an oldest child in my family, and I know who has the most credible information in any family, and that is the oldest child. We are the keepers of history. So anyway, I took it as a good sign that Kathleen Kennedy Townsend's daughter came to one of my book events in Washington, D.C. I took it as official recognition that I had it right. The oldest child is correct. So this is just a quick scene, just to give you a taste of the book, where Charlie is at a fancy party at the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, being thrown by Conrad Hilton after Congress passed a bill to let cheap Mexican labor come over the border more easily, which they actually did that actual day or that actual week. Charlie goes, and he and Roy Cohn start getting into a fight. An argument. Roy Cohn's such a fun character to write because you could just make him be really smart and just the worst person in the world, except for possibly Joe McCarthy. So anyway, at this point, Bob Kennedy walks in and tries to settle the two because they seem to be squaring off. And again, I apologize for my Kennedy accent. Evening, Roy, Bob Kennedy said, approaching them. Recognizing Charlie, he said, Congressman. Charlie Marder, Charlie said, not sure if Kennedy remembered his name. In Washington, Charlie had noticed, people tended to avoid names in case they got them wrong. They tended to say, nice to see you, instead of nice to meet you. in case they had met you before. New social rules for an egoistic town where every monument and street was named for their predecessors. Right, of course, said Kennedy. We met you and your lovely wife at Martin's Tavern. I just heard you're working with Estes on the upcoming juvenile delinquency hearings. Cohn choked on his drink. It turned out he was laughing. You're part of those bullshit comic book hearings? He guffawed dramatically. Kennedy grinned and looked at Charlie apologetically. Charlie was not particularly amused. He'd had enough of Cohn's abrasive company by now. You were asking me about the commie simps in this room, Congressman, Cohn said. Well, they worry me more than Wonder Woman does. He took another swig of his drink and stared out the window. But none of them concerned me as much as the commie simps over there in that big white building, motioning with his chin toward the White House. What must the world look like from that address? It must look upside down. Goddamn Ike protects the commies and screws with Senator McCarthy. Cohn looked at Kennedy. He's terrified Joe will run for president, you know. Joe could beat him, too. Joe McCarthy could beat President Eisenhower? Asked Charlie incredulously. Beat the smartest general we've had since Sherman? Smart, said Cohn. MacArthur called Ike the best clerk he ever had. And Ike said he studied drama under General MacArthur for 4 years. Kennedy chuckled. Now, gentlemen, MacArthur, said Charlie sarcastically, pretending to search the skies for a reminder of the general so ignominiously fired by Truman 3 years earlier. The name rings a bell. MacArthur's a great man, a patriot, said Cohn. I'm sure you have a Medal of Honor under your shirt there? No, said Charlie. Just some shrapnel. He finished the rest of his drink. Nothing like your paper cuts from the Battle of Torts 101. An awkward silence hung like a noose. Charlie had surprised even himself with that one. Liquid courage, he supposed. Kennedy tried to break the tension. Why do you think Joe would be a good president, Roy? If Joe were president, Cohn said, the first thing he would do would be to end the Cold War. He'd pick up the phone and call Joe Stalin and say, this is Joe McCarthy. I'm coming over tomorrow to talk about things. Meet me at the Moscow airport at 1 o'clock. When he arrived in Moscow, he would sit down with Stalin in a closed room. First, he'd tell a couple dirty jokes. Then he'd look Stalin right in the eye and say, Joe, what do you want? And Stalin would tell him. They would talk man to man, not like pansy diplomats. They'd find out what each of them wanted and settle their differences. But when Joe left, he'd tell Stalin, the first time I catch you breaking this agreement, I'll blow you and your whole goddamn country off the map. Charlie turned to Kennedy. He can't honestly believe this rubbish, can he? So one of the things about that scene that I like is the entire paragraph where Roy Cohn is explaining why he thinks Joe McCarthy would be a great president is an actual paragraph, except it wasn't said by Roy Cohn. It was said by Joe McCarthy's campaign manager, a guy named Urban Van Susteren, who would go on to have a daughter named Greta Van Susteren. And it really gets to the fact that some of the stuff, the truth in the book is often stranger than the fiction. That paragraph reminded me so much of the pitch that we would hear on the campaign trail about why Trump would be a great negotiator. He'd go into a room with Putin, he'd do this, blah, blah, blah. And you know, like I said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, and I heard a lot of rhyming. And one of the fun things about this book, and it's actually one of the reasons why I included about 10 or 15 pages of endnotes at the end of it, is because there's so many weird details that are real. I wanted people to know that I didn't make it all up. Like, a lot of it actually happened. There's important stuff, and then there's strange little color, like when when McCarthy would drink, which he did a lot, he would also eat a stick of butter. He would just order a stick of butter and eat it with a fork. And I thought it was so strange I put it in there, but I said people are going to think that, oh, it's too weird that I made that up. And so I put in a whole endnote section, which is also probably the researcher nerd in me showing off a little, perhaps. Anyway, so that's the Hellfire Club, and it's doing okay. We're going to debut on the New York Times bestseller list this Sunday at number 3, and we've been selling a lot of books, and I've been going all over the country, and it's really great to be here, and I'm happy to take any questions you have, and I recognize that they might not all be about the book, which is fine, but I do hope you check out the book, so thank you so much. So should I sit here? Okay, cool.
So I'll just kick off the conversation. I was really interested in your choice to write a fiction novel at this time in our history, when I think a lot of journalists are publishing memoirs right now, publishing a lot of nonfiction, and given the parallels between what happened in the McCarthy era and today, did you feel that fiction was a really good way to sort of explore things more allegorically as opposed to writing a work of nonfiction?
Yeah, well, there are a few reasons. Because we're complicated people, and we don't only do things for one reason, right? But one of them was the last book I wrote was called The Outpost: An Untold Story of American Valor. It was a true story about one combat outpost in Afghanistan and its whole 3.5-year history, and then the deadliest battle for the U.S. in 2009. And to be completely candid, it was a very wrenching experience writing that book. I did more than 200 interviews. I traveled to Afghanistan twice. I spent a lot of time talking to people who had sacrificed a great deal, including loved ones and limbs. And while certainly what I went through is nothing compared to what they went through, it was very emotionally taxing. So I was looking for a project that would be fun. That project was important, but it wasn't fun. But then, yes, you're absolutely onto something. I think that I was able to make arguments I wanted to make about, not just about indecency and lies, the kind that we're experiencing now on a daily basis from the White House, but also compromise, also the importance of standing up for what you believe in an allegorical way. I think that if I had tried to do it in a nonfiction way, it would not have worked. But doing it in a way that was combined with a thriller and fun flight of fancy elements, that might make more sense and be more effective.
Do folks in the audience have questions?
Hi. So my question is about lying, actually, and I appreciate that I've noticed, you call out people you're interviewing if they're obviously lying or if they're repeating lies or that kind of thing, and I'm wondering if you think, with your experience, that we may get back to a point where people aren't lying as much, or if this is sort of normal. And I'm also interested in, sort of as a journalist, when you know something is a lie, like, just how are you striking that balance when something is clearly a lie?
So everywhere I go, everybody wants to know whether or not we're ever going to get back to normal, and I don't know. I hope so. I mean, right now we're in a period where, in the last 24 hours, somebody went on Fox Business News and called and attacked John McCain. I called him Songbird John and said, like, he basically smeared his war record. And then somebody at the White House was making fun of the fact that he was dying. I can't even imagine that. I mean, I remember covering the 2000 campaign when John McCain got smeared in South Carolina, but at least that was like shadowy groups, like without direct ties to George W. Bush and his opponents at the time. This is like people just saying things. So we're in a time of lies and indecency, and I see them as part and parcel of the same thing, because it all has to do with we don't care about standards. And I hope we get back to it. I worry. I really do. In terms of calling out lies or untruths or falsehoods or whatever you want to call them, I mean, a lie means it's false and you're saying it anyway. And I try to be more selective about the use of lie versus falsehood in terms of what I can assert. But if President Trump says something wrong, and then after it's been pointed out that it's wrong, he continues to say it, at that point I think it's a lie. Maybe the first time he misunderstood or he misspoke, but and I just think we just need to call these things what they are, because we can't normalize this. We can't normalize making fun of the disabled or making light of people's drug and alcohol problems or the demonization of minorities. It's not acceptable. And that's not to say that he's wrong on immigration or he's wrong on trade, or he's wrong on, I mean, those are issues and we should have those policy debates, but the indecency and the lies, if news anchors aren't willing to say what they are, who is, right? We're supposed to be the arbiters of fact and truth, and like, if we can't say that's not true, then I don't know what we're doing there.
You might have heard last week that there's a new Google News app that was announced. Quite a few people in this room worked on that and continue to work on it. If you had a lot of people and a lot of resources in terms of technology, what would you build?
Oh God, it's such a tough. I was talking to Sanders about this before because one of the things. I use Google News all the time. All the time. I could not do my job without Google. And in fact, by the way, one of the reasons I set my book in 1954, not the main reason by any stretch, but one of the reasons why I set it in 1954 is because every plot of every movie or book that we know and love inevitably would become ruined if it was set now, because it's just like, well, why didn't you just Google it? And realize that every city he's been to has had a rash of serial murders? Or why didn't you just call her? And then I started noticing that that a lot of movies now, people are in the middle of the desert and they don't have cell service because cell phones and Google ruin plots. So anyway, I use Google News. I have to find out more about this app. I've been on I've heard about it, but I've been on this book tour, so I haven't had a time to plunge in. I think one of the problems, and I don't know that this is something that you guys can come up with or what you can solve, but there's so much fake news out there. There's so many lies out there. And it's not just by truepundit.com or whatever. It's, some of them are by Breitbart or, agenda-driven publications. And I don't know how Facebook or Google or anyone, how you make a decision about what is news and what is not news. But since we're talking theoretically in my own perfect universe, I would, I would have some sort of method to help consumers without any sort of political agenda or political bias, a way to discern what's real and what's not. But I don't think that you guys can do that. This is in a perfect world, this is a utopian idea. And I recognize the slippery slope of, well, if you say this about this news organization, what about this news organization? Or if these people are purposely wrong about this story, what about this time that the New York Times or NBC News or whatever got something accidentally wrong, et cetera. So I realize it's a very difficult challenge. And that probably didn't answer your question. I'll think about it more, though.
That's pretty close.
Okay, thanks.
Let's say 10 years from now, you decide to write a novel about today.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the protagonist would be like in your novel.
Well, honestly, I don't think that the Hellfire Club, if you read it, you'll see that there's a lot in the book about the choices that people are facing today, except it's just framed in the 1950s. If you read about the 1950s, you'll see that there were heroes at the time. One of my heroes, now that I've done research on this book, is a woman, Margaret Chase Smith. She was a senator from Maine, first woman elected to the House and the Senate in her own right. In 1950, she went to the floor of the Senate and gave her Declaration of Conscience speech in which she condemned McCarthyism. In 1950, when he was just starting to become popular and powerful. Edward R. Murrow, who's a hero of mine, he didn't go after McCarthy until 1954. And the US Senate didn't censure him until the end of 1954. So she was years ahead. One of the things when you read about that era that you see is that there were a lot of people who failed. The Kennedys failed, quite frankly, and I'm a student of the Kennedys. But Robert Kennedy was the chief Democratic counsel on the McCarthy committee. John F. Kennedy was pretty AWOL when it came to condemning McCarthy. More importantly, McCarthy's fellow Republicans failed. Senator Bob Taft, who ran for president in 1952, lost the nomination to Eisenhower, but the Senate went into Republican hands and Taft became the majority leader. I'm sure that Senator Taft thought that his legacy would be that he's Mr. Conservative, that he stood up for these conservative values, that he represented something important in American foreign policy and American domestic policy. But at the end of the day, he died suddenly in 1953, and a big part of his legacy is he didn't stand up to McCarthy. And if I were a member of Congress, I would think about Bob Taft every day of the year, every day, and think, we all like to think that our legacies are going to be like our achievements. But the truth of the matter is, our legacy and how we're remembered is often dictated by the moral choices that we make or fail to make. And so I don't think I need to write a book about the Trump era because I think what I've written is resonant enough. But you know what? Maybe my son will write it in 50 years and you can say that it was your idea and try to get a share of the profits.
I want to take one of our online questions now. This one is on immigration. I feel media always tends to discuss more about undocumented immigrants, with whom I sympathize, and ignore the plight of legal immigrants who have to get through hellish restrictions. Do you see a change in future where legal immigrants would be considered for discussion in media and elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I think the reason that the media focuses on illegal immigrants or undocumented immigrants is because they are the ones that are being rounded up in ICE raids and being threatened with expulsion, et cetera. We do have legal immigrants on our shows all the time, not because they're legal immigrants, but because they just happen to be incredibly talented, and it turns out they're legal immigrants. Like Ana Navarro, who's from Nicaragua, is a good example. I mean, I think the debate is largely about illegal immigration, although the immigration bill that Cotton and Perdue introduced, which would have a big effect on legal immigration, if that bill ever were to become seriously considered, which I don't think it would as of now, not with this Senate and the Democrats able to block it, I think there would be a lot more discussion and debate about legal immigration. Unfortunately, we have to make choices, and the people in the media tend to go to the bigger story and can't always focus on everything.
So, sort of related to your comments about fake news, a lot of people often just receive news from a single source or from their friends, which may not be fake. It might be good news, but it might also be consistently from one point of view. Do you have any suggestions for how people could be broken out of their ideological echo chambers? Yeah,
I follow more than, not to bring up a competitor, but I follow more than 5,000 people on Twitter, and one of the great things about it is I try to get as many divergent viewpoints as possible, and I completely agree with, look, I was the kid in high school and college that would go to the library and I would read The Nation, and then I would read the National Review. I mean, I was always trying to get news from different perspectives, and my friends in D.C., some of them are very, very liberal, some of them are very, very conservative, and as somebody who is generally fairly politically agnostic in my personal views, which is actually kind of a relief, it's a pleasure for me to try to open my eyes and see how the world looks to everyone. Now, sometimes the world looks to some people rooted like it's not actually this world. It's actually some other world where there's a whole other set of facts that on this world are actually not true. So I tend to avoid those websites and those channels. But I think that I'm giving a commencement address at UMass Amherst later today, and one of the things I'm going to be saying is expose yourself to as many different points of view as possible, because that's how you enrich your knowledge, and not just in terms of liberal versus conservative, but also in terms of military versus non-military, or what does the world look like from Yemen? What does the world look like from the point of view of somebody who is deeply religious, whether Baptist or Muslim or Jewish? I mean, to expose yourself to all different points of view, I think, is so important. It's a big part of what you guys do, I know, and it's a big part of what I do too.
Thank you for being here with us this morning. We appreciate you spending some time. I do have a question, but I just want to get everything on the table first, which is to say that we know you're an Eagles fan.
I'm sorry. I knew it was going to come up.
And
isn't it enough, the Celtics? That's not enough?
Yeah, we're happy with the Celtics, and I'm going to be mature and say congratulations.
Well, congratulations to you. You guys, almost swept us.
Yeah,
that's painful for me. I grew up in the 80s when you guys had the master team of Larry Bird. So
yeah.
I'm sorry. Look, we don't win a lot of championships.
And we're spoiled. I get it.
Yeah. How many rings do you need, for God's sake?
No, they earned it. But
I'm sorry. I got a little carried away during football season. I admit it. I'm sorry.
I won't bring up the disparaging remarks about the Patriots.
Please don't, because I actually heard from Robert Kraft about them. So I get it. I got a little heated. I got a little excited.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is about Philadelphia because Boston people don't seem to have this issue. But we have chips on our shoulder, and we feel like we're underdogs, even compared to Boston, even though we're a bigger city than Boston. So I don't understand it, but you guys seem to be to handle your non-New York, LA status much better than we do. I can't explain it.
Well, it was a little different before 2004.
Yeah.
But my question is, so you talked a little bit about how the DC you write about in the book is maybe not that different than the DC we see today. And I think a lot of us, regardless of political leaning, feel pretty fed up, and in some ways at a little bit of a loss about what to do. And we hear a lot of talk about, well, if you really want to make a difference, like run for local office, and that makes sense. And some people are in a position to do that, and many of us maybe are not. So I guess I'm wondering if you have one or two pieces of advice, sort of the first things you'd say to an everyday engaged citizen about what steps to take.
Oh, wow. Okay. So that's a really good question. The truth of the matter is that the best thing you can do is support candidates that you believe in. And if it's local candidates, then you can knock on doors and make phone calls. And if it's candidates in other states, you can send money, or also there are ways to either travel to knock on doors or make phone calls. Also, although generally those kinds of things are better coming from in-state. But I think that Washington is better in some ways than it was in the 1950s because of the post-Watergate reforms. We know more. Believe it or not, the media is much better now than the media was in the 1950s. The media covered up all sorts of stuff for people in power, and we know things. Somebody asked me the other day about how would a journalist in the 1950s cover Scott Pruitt. We wouldn't even know about Scott Pruitt. We wouldn't know any of that stuff. And there wouldn't be reporters covering it as aggressively. If you go back and read newspapers from the 50s, and I did for this book, there was a lot of great journalism being done, but it is much more aggressive today. So things, I think, are better in many ways. There's a lot more money today, and that makes it worse. But on balance, I would say we're probably a little better off. But I honestly think that the best thing that people can do is find candidates who you believe in. And also, I don't think, if you're a Democrat, great. If you're a Republican, great. But I think that people should scratch beneath the surface beyond just party labels. It's important that there be reformers in both parties. It's important that there be people in both parties who are willing to stand up for certain values. There's a guy named probably shouldn't name individual politicians, but let me just say that there are Democrats and Republicans in Washington who I see legitimately raging against the machine and really actually trying to do good and stand up for what is right. And I think it's important to have both parties have that kind of pressure. So if you are not necessarily the most partisan person in the world, I would argue look at the other party and see if there are people from the other party that you can support in the primary. So even if, and also there are certain districts that are never going to elect a Democrat and certain districts that are never going to elect a Republican. There's nothing wrong with, theoretically, finding the best person from the party that's definitely going to win and supporting that party, even supporting that person, even if you disagree with them on issue X, Y, and Z. That's just my view. It's easy for me to say I don't give money to anybody because I'm a journalist. But I just think that a lot of times I don't look at the world and people who live in Washington and political journalists see that partisanship is important and the parties are different, and I'm not disputing any of that. But there are also other ways to split up the town, and one of them is people who want to reform it and people who like how it is because it's the status quo is fine with them. Can I say one other thing about your question, which is it is tougher to challenge yourself and get out of your not you, but get out of one's ideological bubble. Right now, we are in a period where people go home and they put on their team jerseys and watch cable news, and they want to have their beliefs reaffirmed. And I see things on both of our, look, I'm biased because I'm with CNN, but I see things on both channels that are our main competitors, Fox and MS, that I think that's really not telling the whole story. Sometimes I watch MSNBC or I see something on MSNBC and I think, boy, and they make it sound like President Trump's about to be arrested in like the next 5 minutes. And, and then on Fox, there's no Russia investigation? So, I mean, I think breaking free of those bubbles is very important, even though it's more difficult to do that. Sorry.
Great. Well, thanks for being here. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of terminology that we use. So for instance, I'm a big fan of liberal democratic values, but more so in the Thomas Jefferson sense than the Elizabeth Warren sense. Mm-hmm. So as far as lowercase liberal democratic principles, what do you see the media's role as in promoting, defending, championing those values, or being neutral about them relative to maybe illiberal values or undemocratic?
Well, why don't you
values?
since you're would you define lowercase l liberal and lowercase d democratic values? How would you
Sure. So I'll borrow the definition from Yasha Monk, who was here a couple months ago, giving a similar talk, which is liberalism in the sense of civil liberties, standing up for the voice and the rights of minority groups or marginalized groups in society, and democracy being the will of the people, translated through some process or representation through government. And these can be at odds, right? But for instance, if the majority of the people decide that, yes, we need to strip this minority group of certain rights or certain voting rights or their voice, there's some tension there. But together, it seems like that's kind of the magical package that when America throughout history is kind of operating at its best, we find a good balance of that. But at times we kind of get off balance and off kilter about that. So I'm curious, those combined values, which don't always naturally go together, how do you see the media as having a role with those values in kind of promoting them, or being more neutral about them, like the media ideally should be neutral about partisan political policy issues?
Yeah, it's a challenging question. I mean, I think first of all, one of the things that's at the heart of your question is the idea that we should be covering individual issues on their merits and not, without the partisan divide necessarily as the only prism through which we see. I mean, so for instance, if we're talking about NSA wiretapping or drone strikes or whatever, we should just be talking about that in terms of the efficacy and the morality of it. And I think the best way we can do that is by having intellectually honest guests to discuss them. And sometimes it's in Washington not always the easiest thing in the world to do because people tend to see things through partisan lenses. But for instance, Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut, who's a pretty partisan Democrat, but he was very critical of the Obama administration for its role in, this is not a domestic issue, but for its role in the war in Yemen, the proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran that's going on in Yemen right now. And having him on, whenever there's somebody who is just refreshingly candid and honest and open about a debate, about a principle, Senator Tim Kaine was like that when it came to the authorization for use of military force. I think it's just important to run to those voices so that people can see these issues through non-partisan lenses. In terms of the positions we take, I don't know that it's my job to say the United States should not be doing this, the United States should not be doing that. I think that there are certain lines that we can draw, but really it's much more my job to have on people to have discussions about these and to make sure that these discussions are rooted in facts and truth, and where people can make their arguments one way or the other. I don't necessarily, unless it's stark, I don't think it helps the viewer for me to say, well, this is unconstitutional. That's not for me to say if there's a debate about it.
Great, thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks for coming. So getting back to the parallels between Trump and McCarthy, McCarthy eventually reached a point where he went too far and the party abandoned him and he was censured. Can you foresee any sort of similar scenario where something similar happens with Trump, or do you think it's as straightforward as long as the base supports him, the Republican Party is going to sort of fall in line?
It's a lot more complicated than that because first of all, he's the president and not a Wisconsin senator. Second of all, he's signing bills that the Republicans want him to sign, and he's doing things that, some of them I think, have a support. If he succeeds to any degree in North Korea and the Korean Peninsula, that will be a great thing. But in terms of just the decency and the lies, I don't know. And if I've learned anything about predictions with Donald Trump, it's don't make predictions about Donald Trump. But I do wonder if he were to fire Mueller, what would happen. Would that be a bridge too far? I feel as though Speaker Ryan and Leader McConnell have made it clear, privately and publicly, that they don't think that should happen. I don't know what they are willing to tolerate. And I don't know what Republican members of Congress are willing to tolerate. Having lived through and covered the Clinton years, I find it unimaginable. I mean, if I guess he couldn't have fired Ken Starr because there was an independent counsel law at the time, but behavior is being tolerated now by Republicans that they never would have been tolerated before. And in fact, you can, every day it's just here's what Rudy Giuliani says now, and here's what he said 20 years ago when it was the same exact situation, except it was Bill Clinton. Here's what Mike Pence says now, except here's what he said 2 years ago when it was Hillary Clinton. I mean, so the hypocrisy doesn't seem to bother people very much anymore. I don't know. I don't know how much farther we're going to be tested as a nation in terms of the checks and balances. So far, everything, the American institutions and the separation of powers are still there. The Mueller is still investigating. I don't know. If I had to pick a bridge too far, it would be possibly firing Mueller, but I honestly don't know. And if you go back and look at, the Senate tolerated a lot from Joe McCarthy, a lot. And you go back, he smeared senators in the late 40s. There's this bizarre, it's mentioned briefly in the book, there's this bizarre period in American history where there was a massacre committed by Nazis towards the end of World War II, and then a lot of those Nazis were captured, and they went to a prisoner of war camp in New Jersey, and interrogators, American military interrogators, were accused of being too tough on these Nazis. They weren't torturing them, but they were accused of mistreating them. And at the time, in the late 40s, there was a big movement by German Americans to kind of whitewash what had happened in World War II. And McCarthy was part of that. And he kind of took over this committee he wasn't even a member of that was investigating the alleged mistreatment of these Nazis, and basically smeared the chairman, who ended up retiring. And I have a character in the book saying something like, "Oh, I thought we'd all come to our conclusions about Nazis already," which was something else that I added post 2016. So my only point is, the U.S. Senate tolerated a lot. He smeared war heroes. He smeared U.S. senators. It was only after the Army McCarthy hearings and some violation of Senate rules that they took him on. But a lot of people had been ruined by then.
Brief follow-up on that. Do you think it was more, so after he went after the Army, do you think it was the people sort of, got tired of him and the politicians followed suit, or do you think it was politicians sort of displaying some leadership?
He entered, one of the reasons the book is set in 1954 is because he began that year at the height of his power. It's very, there's a book by David Nichols called Ike versus McCarthy that I used as a basis for some of the plot in the book, which is the idea that Eisenhower was the whole time setting a trap for McCarthy, and the Army McCarthy hearings were part of that. Ultimately, I think McCarthy gave them an opening in the Army McCarthy hearings, and the U.S. Senate took it. But like I said, they tolerated a lot. George Marshall is a hero of World War II. He's a hero of the post-war, and Joe McCarthy smeared him. He wrote a book about him, just attacking him. And there was a time in 1952 when Eisenhower, who was so sick of McCarthy doing this to his friend and mentor, George Marshall, that Eisenhower was going to say something about it during a campaign appearance in Wisconsin. And McCarthy was going to be on stage. And at the last minute, the governor of Wisconsin heard about it and convinced Eisenhower to take it out of his speech. And it was something he regretted for the rest of his life. Although we have to give Eisenhower credit for going to Wisconsin, I guess. Little Hillary Clinton joke there, sorry. But in any case, my only point is, people are willing to put up with a lot until all of a sudden they're not. I don't know where this U.S. Congress is.
So I had a question about the echoes of gun violence that both pervade your book and what's going on today. So it really struck me as reading the book. This violence goes back all the way through our history.
Yeah.
Just the anecdotes about William Talby earlier in the book, and
That's a congressman who killed a reporter.
Yeah, and you think about that in the context of
In Congress.
Yeah.
And the bloodstains are still on the stairs. That's true. Yeah. Once again, and look to the end notes. Sorry.
And now here we are today, and a couple months ago you moderated the town hall at Parkland, and I know you said that was one of the hardest things you ever did, and I just wonder, what can we do? Where do we go from here? And your thoughts on that?
Okay. It was challenging just because the emotions in the room were just so raw. Their daughters and sons and brothers and friends had been murdered 1 week before, and everybody was so raw. And it was an opportunity to facilitate them, to allow them to speak truth to power. But it was difficult, just emotionally. I mean, again, much more so for them than for me, but it was just tough to do, to be around all that pain and heartache. I don't know what the solution is to gun violence in America. I recognize that it's a complicated problem, and it's probably a lot more complicated than policymakers on either side, on the extremes, want to make it seem. There is no way that the U.S. Senate, even under Democratic control, would be willing to ban so-called assault weapons. They won't. Not if Democrats want to control the Senate, they need to have Democrats in there from places like West Virginia and Montana who won't vote for those things. That said, there are a lot of common sense measures that it would seem you would think would be able to get support, ones that the president has expressed support for, and yet when the cameras are off, not so much. I don't have a solution, and if I wish I did. They're obviously the biggest intersection, it seems to me, where there should be action is in the nexus between people with violent emotional problems and their ability to get guns. And it seems to me that the temporary restraining order that allows family members to say to a judge or a police officer, we're worried about this person and we think that they have guns and we're concerned, and they petition the court, that should be something. California experimented with that or passed something like that after the Santa Barbara or San Bernardino? No, I forget. No, Santa Barbara. Oh, Santa Barbara, that little misogynist who drove around killing people. It was after him because his family knew he had problems. And the police went to check him out, but they didn't go into his room. Anyway, there are things that can be done in that nexus between people with violent, emotional, and mental problems and people, and the ease with which anybody can get a gun. And it seems like that is an area where policymakers should focus as much attention as they can, because it seems to be the area where there is as much, where there's a lot to do. But the truth of the matter is, most gun deaths in this country are suicides, not murders. I'm not saying that's not as serious, but when people say 30,000 a year, 2/3 of them are suicides. And most of the gun deaths are not mass weapon slaughters. They are handguns and individual occurrences, oftentimes men killing women in their lives. So Parkland is, that kind of thing doesn't happen as much in terms of body count. The more serious thing has to do with individual handgun shooting incidents, and I don't know what can be done.
Okay. Hi, big fan since
Thank you.
You were a guest host on ABC This Week. It was
Thanks.
when I first heard you. Non-Washington question. You mean Washington is polarized, but country is pretty polarized too. It's probably about 8 states, right, where you have a chance of moving the needle. My brother lives in Missouri, and he canceled his cable bill because anytime any election comes, it's wall-to-wall political ads.
Yeah.
Right? So this seems like a much harder question, right? If I ask myself, I'm fairly liberal. Even if I was conservative in this state, I have no shot of doing anything. If everybody's like me, then what is the principle that causes states to shift? How do you, I mean, because if you don't remove the polarization like in the people. You're never going to remove the polarization in politics. So
I don't know. I'm not an expert on demographic shifts or why certain states become more liberal or more conservative. It's obviously been, I've seen it happen in my life as the Northeast has become decidedly more progressive and other parts of the country have been decidedly more conservative. I mean, I'm old enough to remember, Democrats represent, not just Democrats, white Democrats representing parts of the South. They're mainly, it seems like the Southern Democrats, a lot of them are African American because they represent African American districts, redistricted. And I'm old enough to remember liberal Republicans, all, when Susan Collins was not, an endangered species, when it was there were a lot of.
yeah, I mean, there are none in the House now, and there were a lot.
Yeah, not from New England, right? I mean, although you have Charlie Baker here, so it's not like it can't be done. It can be done. I don't know why it happens. I think it just has to do with one of the things going on is just people siloing themselves off from people with different points of view, whether it's cable news or news in general or websites or politicians. We just seem to be becoming a more tribal society in terms of our political beliefs. Yeah, I mean, every 4 years I hear about how Missouri is a purple state, and I never believe it. And but I have lived long enough to see purple states go from red to blue and from blue to red. I mean, I have lived long enough to see. I remember when John Kerry was trying to get Colorado in 2004, and I thought he was on drugs. But now Colorado is pretty solidly purple, if not blue. Amazingly, I can't even believe it happened. Barack Obama won Indiana. I mean, it did happen in 2008. So, different candidates can win over a populace based on who they are. But generally speaking, I just think we're becoming more tribal.
So I'm curious about, as your career has spanned time before the internet was a big thing, and then now we have Twitter, and it feels like everything has just sort of accelerated. The news cycle is faster and faster, and curious how both how you feel about that, and also how that sort of factored in when you go back and look at the 50s, researching that and then writing about it in a world when we didn't have Twitter and things weren't happening so quickly. A great example of that would be Scott Pruitt's. There was so much news about Scott Pruitt one week, and then by Friday it was like gone because everybody had moved on to the next scandal.
Yeah, I mean, the Scott Pruitt situation is, I can just tell you, somebody who's responsible for an hour of news show every day, is that President Trump pushes Scott Pruitt off our deck. I mean, President Trump doesn't, we'll have like a Scott Pruitt piece. This has happened now at least twice, if not 3 times, that we had a piece about Scott Pruitt's 5 most recent scandals. And then President Trump did or said something, and we didn't have time to get to Scott Pruitt. I mean, so Donald Trump is the best thing that ever happened to Scott Pruitt in every way. It's funny because so my first job in journalism was after freelance was I worked for Washington City paper, and then I worked for Salon.com. It was very different than what it is today. It was much more. It was much more. It was non-ideological. It was just a lot of different points of view. It leaned left because it was based in San Francisco, but it was a lot of different points of view. And I'll tell you, it was amazing working for Salon.com in 1999 and 2000, covering the presidential race, because at the time, and some people here might be too young to remember this, at the time, other websites only updated once a day. So I would be on the road with people from the LA Times and the New York Times and ABC News and Washington Post, whatever, and something would happen, and I would write a piece on my laptop and send it in, and it would post on Salon, within an hour, and I would scoop everybody. Not because I was such a great reporter, but because their websites weren't going to update until the next morning at 6 a.m. It's crazy. And then I remember the Washington Post took this amazing step that they were going to do one day, every day at 4 o'clock they were going to do one update. So it was awesome for me being on the tip of the spear of the internet journalism, because all these dinosaurs that I was competing with didn't realize what was going on, or they were, ultimately they did. Now the news cycle is crazy. But when writing the book, the most you could hope for then was there was an afternoon newspaper. There was the Washington Post in the morning and the Washington Star in the afternoon in D.C. It was just, and the news early on, the evening news was 15 minutes. And then, then they adapted it to become half an hour. So it was just like a glacier moving the news in that era compared to what we deal with today, where I'm getting the shakes because I want to go to my phone right now and find what has happened in the last hour and a half. What has President Trump done? What is going on in the world? Because it changes. We'll be in the middle of a show. I remember one time, just in the last couple months, and at the top of the show, I just laid out all the huge events that had happened just in the last 24 hours. And that was in our A block. And by our C block, Hope Hicks had resigned. And I said, remember when I did that commentary 6 months ago about all the, oh wait, that was 15 minutes ago. That's what it feels like, this news cycle. It's just a different era. By the way, I can't imagine, this has to be it, right? We can't get any more insane than this. It doesn't, at a certain point, it would have to actually be traveling back in time or something like that. This is as crazy as it gets, I would think.
I think we have time for about one more question.
All right. I hate to be the last question with this, but can I ask you about Kellyanne Conway?
Sure.
So I think last weekend she did the rounds on the Sunday shows, and it seems like every time she does one of these Sunday shows, not only is it kind of a lost segment because you don't get any information out of her, but the interviewer always seems to leave it off kind of frustrated.
Yeah.
And it just seems like a waste of that segment of the show. So
why
have her on?
Why have her on?
Yeah.
So you're not the first person to ask me this week. Stephen Colbert, I did an event at the 92nd Street Y Wednesday night, and Stephen Colbert asked me the same question, so you're in good company. Here's the answer. First of all, she's a senior counselor to the president, so if there is something going on and we want answers to questions, other than the president, who hasn't given me an interview since the Judge Curiel questions that I asked him in June 2016, there isn't anyone necessarily better. And Sunday I had questions about Michael, what was it? I guess Michael Cohn, I forget. We're 300 scandals ago, but there was something. Oh, it was Rudy Giuliani had basically let the cat out of the bag that the president had lied.
Right. Yeah, but it didn't matter what you were
Thank you,
asking.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much. I'm not above being fact-checked. I appreciate it. So how do you explain this? So that's one. Two, I thought it was interesting that the premise of all my questions, accurate, but also a premise, was the president lies so much. Why? Why does the president tell so many lies? And her response was, the president does many things. That's a quote.
Yeah.
The president does many things, right? And why aren't you covering this, and this, as opposed to the lies? So I thought it was interesting. I thought we were making progress. Here we are, we're making progress. She's not disputing the fact that the president tells lots of lies. And Roy Blunt, Senate Republican leadership, was in the next interview. Also, does it bother you that the president lies so much? Was my question. Well, it would bother me a lot more if we weren't getting so much done. So once again, we've made progress. They're acknowledging that the president tells lies. I felt like a small victory there. Third, 63 million people voted for Trump. I don't think it's not worthwhile to have the Trump point of view represented on any number of issues, including hers. She was trying to explain what the president meant when he was on Air Force One, and he said, no, he didn't know about the payment. Whatever. And then fourth, and this one is actually, I think, the most important to me, I think there is value in a news anchor challenging people in power, even if, she's not, this isn't an Aaron Sorkin scripted Sunday talk show. I mean, she's not going to say, "You're right, he's a liar. What am I doing?" But I think viewers can get something out of feeling represented, at least. Why does he tell these lies? You know, for instance, the president said that Obama had tried to get these 3 hostages out of North Korea and failed, but he was going to do it. You know, 2 of them were taken hostage during the Trump administration. So that would have been a neat trick if Obama had actually anticipated and not been able to prevent it. But so just to say it, it's not true. It's a lie. I think there is value in that. That said, it's not as though it isn't a discussion that we have every time we book a Trump guest. It is a discussion that we have. What are we going to get? Why would we do it? We turn down people. Anyway, that's my reasoning.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone, for coming.
Thanks for being here, everyone. Really appreciate it.